Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you had a good break. It's good to see you today. Any rate, I thought we'd wrap up what we were doing before the break, whatever that was, and go to the next chapter. So I believe we were in chapter 9, and we spent quite a bit of time. Last week we met talking about tariffs and how tariffs are used to protect domestic producers that have to compete with imports from various parts of the world and so forth. So I thought we would work one more problem out of that chapter and talk about export subsidies here, which may be part of an industrial plan for a country or something like that. Export subsidies, where we want to encourage our exporting sector to produce for the rest of the world and so forth. And one of these problems would be problem 10 on page 187 of your text. So I thought we would look at this, problem 10 on page 187. Let's see here. Okay, so it says, consider a small country that exports steel. Suppose that a pro-trade government decides to subsidize the export of steel by paying a certain amount for each ton sold abroad. So certainly suppliers are going to produce more and deliver more to the market. Much of this will go abroad. If the government's paying a little bit for the ultimate price that producers are receiving for each unit of steel, they're going to produce more. Okay, it's going to encourage productions and therefore export. So how does this export subsidy affect the domestic price of steel, the quantity of steel produced, the quantity of steel consumed, and the quantity of steel exported? So they're asking for quite a bit here. How does it affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, government revenue, and total surplus? Lots of questions here. I'm not sure we'll answer them all. Some of this I may leave for you to ponder on a little bit, but the overall question here, is it a good policy from the standpoint of economic efficiency? So we've been using this concept of economic surplus to measure efficiency, haven't we? And so they say the analysis of an export subsidy is similar to the analysis of a tariff. And so when we were looking at tariffs, you know, for an importing country where in autarky, the domestic price for the good was higher than the world price. So it makes sense for consumers domestically to import if they can, and they will. And so we saw how with tariffs, I'll just kind of sketch this out just real quick. We had this situation where you're importing, okay? At autarky, you had a price here, but the world price, the P sub W, I'm sorry, here we go. P sub W is down here. So if this is the demand curve and this is the supply curve for the good, whose price is measured on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal. This was a tariff, okay? I mean, this is review. This isn't this question here in particular. I'm just saying that they say the analysis in this problem here with an export subsidy is similar to the situation we had here, where you know, the world price exists at a level lower than the equilibrium price if the country didn't trade. And so quantity demanded would exceed quantity supplied. And so this would be, you know, the amount of imports. Okay. And so, you know, with tariffs, we may try to restrict that a little bit. Recall with a tariff is a tax on units. And so we would draw this little picture here where the amount of the tariff being applied to each unit here that's imported would diminish imports from this distance here. Remember, you always measure horizontally. So the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied, right? You measure horizontally here. It's going to be lower now than it was before, okay? So, and the tariff is kind of forcing that because the price that demanders pay is increased. and the price received by suppliers is increased as well. So that induces more supply, but then causes a diminished quantity demanded. And then we looked at these areas here. These are deadweight losses, right? This is additional cost of suppliers delivering to the market. But the suppliers under the tariff are going to deliver more than they would under free trade, at the world free trade price. And that's going to come at a cost. So this area here, this little triangle here, is the deadweight loss associated with additional production. And then you have some missing trades here. So you have a deadweight loss on this side. That is the economic surplus loss because there's fewer trades. Okay, there's fewer people consuming. So again, this discussion was in Chapter 9. They gave us a picture of this. Let's see here. Where was this? I won't be able to find it now because I'm looking through Chapter 8 instead of Chapter 9. But at any rate, let's see. Let me just call your attention to this picture because I know we had it here in your text. It's on page 176. So spend a little time. We marked this up and so forth. Okay, so we looked at the economic impact, if you will, of imposing a tariff on imported goods. Now here we're going to subsidize a good for export. We want to encourage exports. We want to help our exporting sector of the economy. So it's kind of the reverse of this situation here. You have the equilibrium price without trade down here, but now with trade, the idea is we're exporting this good because we can produce it and actually exchange it domestically at a price less than what the world price would be. So the world price, I mean, that looks good to our suppliers and so forth. So we would draw a picture kind of like this. I'm going to draw the same supply and demand curve here. Quantity, quantity, price. Let Alfred Marshall mess me up there again. We like to put the independent variable on the horizontal axis, but alas, that's not how things work in economics, right? So if this is an exporting country here, then the equilibrium price, we just noticed here, I guess I called without trade price. I'm going to write here without trade would be at this level here. But the world price is higher than this. That's why we're going to get to export. Okay, this is supply and this is demand. So the world price is up here. Okay, so it's maybe somewhere up there. But here's the deal. We're going to get to charge that price by adding a subsidy plus subsidy. Okay, the world price or the price without trade, let's just put it here, P without trade plus the subsidy. Okay, I think it's probably the way I want to write that. So you got the price without trade, but we got a subsidy here that's going to allow us now to charge a higher price. The supply side of the market's going to charge a higher price. They're going to produce more because of that. It's going to incline them to produce more units. And you know, the world price may be here. Okay, I'm going to put this as the world price. So you have the price without the subsidy, you have the subsidy, and then you have the world price. I kind of like my diagram I've got right here. This is a little easier to see. Okay. All right, let's just put this up here. Okay. So maybe this country exports steel, I think they say. So here's the world price, again, is higher than the price without trade, which would be right here. And I guess this should be world price plus the subsidy. I'll talk about that in just a minute. So if you make that, my first inclination was right, the world price plus the subsidy, because the idea is, of course, consumers can always purchase, be they domestic or foreign, but certainly the domestic consumers can purchase steel at the world price. Okay. They can produce it and sell it at a lower price, but consumers in the domestic market can go out and buy steel on the world at the world price. So here's the world price, and the subsidy is going to raise the price received by suppliers of steel. Okay, so we have some welfare effects that are going to that are going to result from this policy of supplying a subsidy to the supply side of the market. So let's compare these two. Okay. All right. Can y'all still see that? Let me go right here. So I'm going to talk about without the subsidy, with the subsidy. For both consumers, producers, and for the government, okay? And there's going to be a change that's going to be associated with each of these. So I'm going to have to write or back this off just a little bit. Hopefully you can still see that. So you got consumer surplus first off. Consumer surplus. Without the subsidy, consumers are going to pay the world price for steel. Suppliers are going to charge the world price for steel. Now that they're trading. If there were no trade, that would be down here, okay? But suppliers are not going to receive a low price when they can receive a high price for each unit of steel that they sell. So, without the subsidy that's provided to suppliers, consumers are going to pay the world price. And if they pay the world price, then consumer surplus is the area of these two regions right here. It's the area below the demand curve and above the price they pay. Okay? So this is going to be A plus B. A plus B. Now with the subsidy provided to the suppliers, guess what? Consumers are still going to go out and buy steel on the world market. This price is not going to be affected as far as what the price is that consumers are going to pay. Consumers are still going to continue to pay the world price, even though suppliers receive a subsidy. That doesn't affect the demand side of this market. So with the subsidy, consumer surplus again is A plus B. So that now the change really for consumers, because there's a subsidy provided here to the supply side of the market, is not going to change at all. Consumers are going to continue to pay the world price for each unit of steel that they purchase. But how about producers? You got a change in producer surplus here. Okay, producer surplus. Now at the world price, do you see what producer surplus is going to be? Which areas would that be? So it would be below the price they receive, but above the supply curve, right? Which is the marginal cost of production. Okay, so they would receive areas E, F, and G. Okay, E plus F plus G. But now with the subsidy, since they get a subsidy for each unit that they deliver to market, the price now they receive is up here. So the area below the price they receive and above the marginal cost curve, the supply curve, is not only E, F, and G, but also now will include B and C. So I'm going to say that this is B plus C plus E plus F plus G. Okay? So what's the change here? Well, producer surplus went up by this amount right here, B plus C. Producer surplus increased by B plus C. Okay, so there was no change in consumer surplus. They're going to continue to purchase at the world price, but domestic suppliers will sell all the steel they can produce abroad here at this, really for them, winds up to be a net price of the world price plus the subsidy here. So they're receiving some additional income on each unit of steel they produce from the government. Okay, the government's paying them to produce steel. Pretty good deal, pretty sweet deal. Well, how much is it costing the government to affect this policy? All right. Well, government surplus, if you will, is initially zero without the subsidy. It doesn't cost the government anything to not provide a subsidy. But now you realize that the quantity supplied extends all the way out here. I'm going to call this the second quantity supplied after the subsidy is, you can use different notation if you want, but after this subsidy is imposed or attached to each unit. Q2 is over here now instead of over here. So with this subsidy, Q2 is here. So this is the quantity supplied to the market. And the magnitude of the subsidy is this distance right here. This is the subsidy. It's the difference vertically between those two curves. So B plus C plus D is the cost of this program to the government. And I'm going to put negatives in front of these instead of saying it's B plus C plus D. Whoops, I'm sorry. This should be a subtraction sign. So each of these areas is costing the government something, okay? So there's this initial quantity demanded, the subsidy is being applied to that. There's also the, well, in fact, all three of these areas here, this is the total amount supplied. Every unit supplied is afforded, or is going to cost the government. The subsidy, whatever this, if it's $1 per ton of steel, then it's $1 times this quantity here, Q2. Okay? So the change here is negative B minus C minus D. That makes sense? Okay, let me get the picture back in here. Can y'all see those letters? There we go. Okay, so the change here, you see, total effect is the B and the C's wash out, but you get here a change in economic surplus of a negative D. And this is the total surplus after the subsidy. Okay, total surplus after the subsidy is negative. The change in total surplus is negative. Now what does that tell us, or what's the moral of this? It says suppliers are made a lot happier, right? Suppliers are going to increase their total happiness or welfare or economic surplus. Consumers are indifferent. Consumers pay the same price regardless of whether the subsidy is applied to exporters or not. They're going to purchase steel on the world market at P sub W. This is what consumers are going to pay. They're going to pay that regardless. But suppliers are going to receive this for each unit. Okay, so this is going to cost somebody something because there's a difference between the price received by suppliers and the price paid by demanders. And that's the magnitude of the surplus, which is S here. Okay, surplus, you apply that to each unit. So the total cost to the government is B plus C plus D, but some of that is transferred, if you will, as additional producer surplus. So the government's going to collect this amount here, and then they turn around basically in the process of applying the subsidy is they're giving this to the supply side of the market. So the net effect here is this little area here, quantity D here, is the area of a triangle. If you assume these are linear curves, and that area there would be the kind of like the dead weight loss, if you will, or the additional cost overall to this whole macroeconomy because of the surplus program. Okay, so we're producing more units than we did before. Before the surplus or subsidy, we were producing Q1 units. Now we're producing Q2 units. And those additional units here come at a cost. They don't just come down out of heaven on a string. Okay, the factory or a steel mill's got to produce each of these tons of steel here, and each one of those come at a cost. So we talked before about how the supply curve is a marginal cost curve. The demand curve is a marginal benefit curve. We'll be looking more at that, using that more later when we talk about cost of production. That's somewhere like chapter 12, something like that. But what you're capturing with the supply curve is the additional cost for more units that are now being produced and sold on the world market by the domestic producers. Okay, so they're ramping up production, but that costs something. It's obviously going to be rewarded by the government because of the subsidy, but the additional cost to the supply side, just production cost, is captured by this area D, which we call here negative D, as the effect on total economic surplus. So this kind of, again, shows how when the government selects winners and losers, in this case, the winner, consumers aren't losing except that they're taxpayers, but the consumer side of the market, the demand side of the market is back where they were. The supply side is certainly cleaning up. They're doing better. Well, they'll get a subsidy for each ton of steel. Steel makers are happy, but that doesn't come without cost. The cost is the total area here, B, C, and D, and part of that is due to the fact we're producing more than we had previously. Okay, so anyway, does that make sense, class? You see how that's kind of the opposite of what we did with the tariff? Just a little thing you got to keep in mind, though, is that after the subsidy, consumers continue to pay the world price. Okay, we're not restricting them from paying the world price, but producers are receiving the subsidy, okay, this little bit here. And so that's going to be what's a little different here than the analysis that we had, again, on page 176 here in this diagram. Okay, so you have the tariff situation here. Look through this, if you will, as we explained why you have these two deadweight losses here. But then you have the subsidy situation that we just looked at that also comes with some cost, perhaps not as much, you would think, because this area D looks minuscule by comparison to what we were just looking at with the tariffs. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And that's kind of a wrap on Chapter 9, I think. I've put a few problems for you to do up on MindTap. You can follow this analysis. There's several problems with tariffs, not that many with subsidies, but again, you should be able to draw that graph. Think again with a tariff that the domestic price and autarky would be less than the world price, or I guess greater than the world price. So the world price is below equilibrium, and so we protect importers by that per unit tax. This is certainly a timely topic and discussion in the news today as we're contemplating in the United States and actually imposing tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, China, and so forth, raising those tariffs and so forth. So at any rate, especially spend some time talking about looking at gains and losses associated with tariffs there on page 172 of your text. I guess it's on page 176, rather. Okay, any questions? All right, well, let's go to externalities today. All right, so here we're going to look at how, first off, the market, just the marketplace itself, does not achieve the socially maximum outcome. That is, the outcome that's most efficient for society as a whole. We've talked about allocative efficiency and how where you got that supply curve and that demand curve and where they intersect produces the quantity of goods in that market that's best for society. However, we left somebody out. Oftentimes there's a third party that's bearing a cost or perhaps receiving a benefit that's not represented by those two sides of the market that we look at in traditional supply and demand framework. Okay, these are called third parties. An example, we'll look at some examples of this, but if you got a paper mill in your town on the river, we've got that in my hometown, and sometimes I'll go out, and it's just a fact. I'm not trying to slam the paper mill. They provide a lot of goods and a lot of jobs in our community. But there are times in the evening I'll go out and I go, wow, I smell that paper mill. Okay. All right. And so I may say, in fact, if it's bad enough, I may say, let's cancel that little cookout we were going to have this evening. Let's move indoors, because that paper mill is smelling up the town. Well, you see, I'm paying a cost. And I may not necessarily be a seller of paper in that mill or that company that owns the mill. In other words, I'm not on the supply side of that market. I may also not be on the demand side of that market. I may not purchase products from that paper mill, but I'm still bearing a cost. Okay, so from society's point of view, total society's point of view, if you factor my preferences in with those who actually participate directly in the market, from society's point of view, there's probably more activity at that paper mill. That is, there's more output, more product being generated in that paper mill than society would prefer. Okay, because if I got a vote, I don't get a vote, I don't get the dollar vote if I'm not a supplier or demander, but if I had a vote, I'd say, you know what, let's produce a little less paper. I'd rather have fewer evenings in the summer where I can breathe. Okay, now I'm not slamming the paper mill that much, but this is just an example of where the market can neglect to factor in the preferences of people who are in the broader economy, but really do not get to cast a dollar vote. There are a lot of other examples. Your book lists some of these on page 190. Of course, exhaust from automobiles is something similar to this. People breathe exhaust in a town. They may live near the freeway and never get out on the freeway. Okay, so this is called a negative externality. Negative externalities impose costs on people who are not represented by the market. Barking dogs in a town. Okay, that's another one. So, may not have any ordinance in your town against a barking dog, or maybe you do, but suppose you don't, and a neighbor down the street has a dog that bark, 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 bark all night, keeps you awake, you don't sleep. You are paying a cost for that dog. Now, there's a benefit of the dog to the owner. The owner presumably is enjoying having the dog. There's a benefit, but there's also a cost that may not be represented anywhere in the marketplace. That would be another negative externality. In the last couple of years, we emerged from this pandemic. There's negative externalities that were considered, still being considered, that are associated with that pandemic. We dealt with that in a certain way in our country. Different countries handled it differently, but certainly if people were just allowed to conduct their activity as previously, go to the grocery store, go to the restaurant, not take any precautions and so forth, then we're not sharing exhaust or pollution or barking from a dog with their neighbors, but we can be sharing germs with their neighbors. That would be a negative externality. Okay, so how does the government deal with that? In that case, the government kind of regulated it. Here in the United States, they said, in fact, there were areas where you couldn't open your restaurants and so forth. There were regulations that were brought to the fore that kind of controlled human behavior to diminish the spread of that negative externality, if you will. There are also positive externalities. Probably many of you today are benefiting from a government program that promotes more activity because of a positive externality. Now again, first off, negative externalities from the society's point of view, all of society, the market's just part of all of society. Negative externalities generally are generated in too great of a quantity. Okay, there's too much pollution, there's too much barking dogs. But positive externalities, like technological transfer, the education you're going to receive and be able to impart to other people. You don't have to be a teacher to impart your education and benefit humankind You may become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever it is. Your education's going to benefit the broader economy. And so in that case, that's called a positive externality, and we want more of those sorts of things from society's point of view. So we might subsidize instead of tax those things which we want less of. We're going to see here in a little bit, we may subsidize those things we may want more of. Other positive externalities, you know, somebody may go into a downtown that's kind of in disrepair and buy a few buildings and restore those buildings. The whole city can benefit from that, okay? There are these positive spillovers, if you will. Sometimes you hear that term used. That result because somebody is rehabilitated some area of town. Just when you paint your house, or if you buy a house in a neighborhood, it needs to be painted. When you do that, that increases the value of the homes around that house, so we can imagine. And so those are called positive externalities, and we may want to encourage those again in various ways. The government may say, hey, we want more of that, let's subsidize that, or provide some other incentives to the supply side of the market. Okay, so you have positive externalities and you have negative externalities. So how do you correct for the fact that these externalities exist and drive us, and consequently the market equilibrium is not where society as a whole would want us to be. Okay? In other words, first off, you start with this diagram they give you here on page 191 of your text. We're familiar with that, supply and demand curve. But this represents only the private side of the market. You have a private cost and you have private demand here. And of course they equilibrate here at a quantity of whatever this is. Say it's steel, or I like paper mill better. We can understand the negative externalities associated with paper mills. So if you just represent suppliers and demanders here for paper at the mill, and then this is the quantity that would be produced. But of course, if there's a negative externality, this quantity from society's point of view is what? Too high or too low? Too high, that's right. So, you know, if I get to cast a vote now, because I breathe this stuff, from my point of view, that's too high. Now, how are we going to correct for that? Well, we're going to talk about perhaps applying a tax to one side of this market here. Here's a tax that would produce another supply curve, if you will, or marginal cost curve of production that includes this, my cost, my particular cost, the external cost, because I have to breathe the air that comes out of that smokestack. So if I breathe enough of that, I get sick, I have to go to the doctor. If I go to the doctor, there's cost being imposed on me. I'm external to the market that I'm going to tack on here to the private cost, just the cost that's associated with production itself, to represent the social cost. Okay, the social cost is the private cost plus the external cost. The external cost is tacked on to the private cost to get the social cost. So now you get this social cost curve. So what I want you to see here then, of course, is that from society's point of view, this is the optimal quantity to produce. Okay, the intersection here between the social cost curve and the private demand curve. Okay, in other words, the market itself, if you're just looking at the market, you don't have this curve. And we're overproducing. We're producing more. We're not achieving allocative efficiency, is the point here. Before we talked about allocative efficiency, what is best for society is right here. Okay, but we had kind of a restrictive view of who the participants are. So when we talked about Adam Smith and so forth, and the invisible hand driving the market toward allocative efficiency, we had a simpler notion of how things work. Now we're going to factor in those who are affected either positively or negatively by the activity that's occurring here in this case on the supply side of the market. So we're overproducing. Now, it would be the goal then of policymakers to try to create some incentives at least that would drive us toward this outcome instead of this outcome. Okay? So one way we might achieve that, there's different ways we're going to see, but is actually to apply a tax to the supply side of the market for each unit. If you apply a tax to each unit produced, then the net cost to the people who make the decisions on the supply side is going to be up here. Okay? So they call that a Pigovian tax after Arthur Pigou. So I think you pronounce the tax differently than you do his name. But there's a picture of Arthur Pigou in your text. Let me just say right here on page, here he is. And he's the one, he's kind of a famous economist, and he's the one who said, okay, we can achieve that social optimal outcome by, again, applying a tax to the supply side of the market. So that's what we could do here to achieve, whoops, I'm sorry, this diminished quantity that's being traded. So there's too much paper being made in the paper mill. How do we achieve a diminished quantity here that's being produced and traded? Is by applying a tax. Okay, so your book kind of talks about that, kind of a story there. So this is where we want to be now if we factor everybody in. And I think we could all agree with that. I mean, there's some extremist. I mean, I'm a free market guy. Believe in private sides of the market, so private suppliers and private demanders. But suppliers and demanders, especially in this case suppliers, should not be able to conduct their activity with total disregard to the welfare of the broader economy. We've been through that in our history in the United States. We've had periods where we let producers do whatever they want. And the mainstream philosophy was, well, what's good for producers, what maximizes dollar profit is what's best for society. After all, they put people to work and so forth. But I remember, I'm old enough to barely remember, I believe, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland. I think I remember the episode. Of course, I know about the episode because I'm an economist. But the river there in Ohio caught fire. Okay, you think of a river burning, okay? But a river caught fire because of the pollutants on the river, okay? And so, man, when you think about that a little bit, the factories that were dumping flammable materials that float on the surface of that water and so forth, from the broader society's point of view, is probably not a good thing. And there were people bearing a cost there who were not being represented by the market itself. So we had, certainly during the Nixon administration, okay? Nixon was a Republican, but nevertheless, to some degree, he was kind of a big government Republican. But you had the rise of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. If you want to get a sense of how much power the EPA has, go to Washington, D.C., walk down Constitution Avenue from the Capitol, go on west, and look to your right, and you'll walk past the EPA building. It's huge, okay? It's a huge building. There are thousands of people who walk in and out of that building every day, and over the years, they're responsible for writing lots of regulations and so forth that constrain our economy from, causing these costs that we see are inimical to some people, to such an extent. I mean, rivers were catching fire. If you just start dumping benzene at will in a river and so forth, there's people who get cancer from that and so forth. So obviously there's a role for government to drive us to this point as opposed to this point. But, again, we had decades of what we might call the robber baron, just a little bit, where a capitalist, and I don't, that's not a pejorative, I like capitalism, but the titans of capitalism were able to do what they wanted to without any constraint. So there's always a price to be paid for that. So at any rate, negative externalities, there's a discussion here. Positive externalities can be encouraged generally by subsidies. There's a picture in your text here where perhaps for education, as you're enjoying today, if you receive any, say a Pell Grant, any assistance from the federal government to go to college, your education's being subsidized. In fact, public education at large is heavily subsidized in the United States. So what's going on there? Well, we're trying to, if you had to pay completely for your education, every one of us had, this is like going grocery shopping. Nobody helps you buy tomatoes. But if no one were helping you buy your education today, there would be fewer of us sitting here today. There would be fewer credit hours being consumed. So if you look purely at the market for higher education, this is where the equilibrium would be. This is where the quantity of the market would exist. But alas, policy makers realize there are positive externalities to be had by having a positive workforce. I mean, say a workforce, just a positive populace. I mean, we can talk about what those things are. I mean, you're going to get a smarter voter, right? You don't have to necessarily get more professionals. You're just going to get people who, when they cast a vote, they're more informed because they learned how to read in school. Think about issues that we've even talked about in this class. I mean, it is my goal that this class, just this class, having taken this class, will make you a more informed citizen and so forth. And so society benefits from that. That's the theory. We could go on and on with this, right? But so the government comes in and provides an external benefit here, rewards the external benefit or promotes the external benefit with a subsidy oftentimes. Because society will value each quantity at a higher price than the private market will. So the social value is above the private value here for each quantity that's being delivered. So really now, the social demand curve, if you will, exists above the private demand curve by the amount of the external benefit. It's kind of hard to capture sometimes. It's hard to quantify what that is. But in principle, we see that the market outcome would provide a quantity less than the socially optimal outcome. So they got the word optimum here. This is what's optimum in the way of the amount of education that should be provided and exchanged in, say, the higher education marketplace. So here we could affect this by subsidizing the demand side of the market. That is, the government gives each student some assistance to go to school. Okay, so that's what a Pell Grant is. Okay. So you want to encourage the market to move toward the socially optimal outcome here with quantity, subsidize the demand side. You can also subsidize the supply side, okay? Now, in that case, a subsidy, in fact, in all cases, subsidies is the opposite of a tax. Okay, so if you supply the supply side, you're essentially adding a negative tax to the marginal cost curve. So in that case, I don't think they have a picture of this, but the story may be, I think they do tell the story of robot technology. Okay, so with robots being produced and so forth, it's like every day I read more and more development in the area of robotics. Well, as we do more of that, we learn things, and there's technology that's shared. Okay, the broader economy benefits. Society benefits as we learn new technologies and so forth associated, say, with robotics. So policymakers may want to encourage that, more of that. Again, not necessarily like we have here, more education. We want more education. Let's subsidize the ones receiving the education, the good or the service. In this case, let's assist those who are producing the robots. Okay, does that make sense? So if you reward the side of the market that's producing in this case, the robotic technology, then you don't tax them, you do the opposite. You provide a subsidy. So you shift the supply curve down, okay? It's kind of a little different than we have here, where the demand curve is shifted up by the amount of the external benefit. That's when you subsidize the demand side. If you subsidize the supply side, you shift the supply curve down by the amount of the benefit. So this is the external benefit here. External benefit. And so, again, the private market would be here with the original supply and demand curve, but now you have a social supply curve, if you will, that one that represents the social value here. So you're going to go from S1 to S2 by providing perhaps a subsidy to the supply side. Okay, that you could call this a Pigovian subsidy. So you have Pigovian taxes and Pigovian subsidies that would achieve this. Now, I've added to the story here, okay, as I did here. The government may or may not actually get in here and encourage this. What I'm saying is there are external costs and benefits that keep these 2 points apart, keep the market from the socially optimal outcome. So the government may, if it chooses to, it may move the market from this point to this point, in this case by providing a subsidy to the demand side, or it may provide that subsidy to the supply side and drive us from this point to this point, so that you get, of course, more of the stuff, okay? More robots, more electric vehicles, whatever it is. And we've certainly seen that, right? In fact, Elon Musk, and I'm not trying to be political here at all. Personally, I kind of like the guy, but he's been slammed. Right? It's interesting. He was the darling of the green side of the political discourse. He was the darling and the champion for so long, and now he's not. Okay, so we won't. They're burning Teslas now, right? As we speak, it's kind of. I think that's a terrible thing. But there's some who are saying, well, Tesla got rich on the back of the American taxpayer. And I even saw a placard the other day that said, Musk pays no taxes. Well, of course, Tesla became, kind of had a first mover advantage in that market, not solely because of all the great ideas Elon Musk had, but because they received a subsidy. Electric vehicle makers receive subsidies from the government. So that can be part of your industrial policy, so that the output of your economy is reflective of what is really in the best interest of society as a whole. So technology spillovers can contribute to the formulation of a proper industrial policy. You want to encourage those things that are good for society. Another way, this has been around for a long time, is patents, okay? Why do we have patents? So if you invent something new, something nobody's developed before, you get maybe a 20-year protection, up to 20 years. There's that you can be the sole producer of that good, or you can license that to someone else, but you have ownership rights. They're established by the government for your idea. And why do we allow that? Okay? Actually, if you're the sole producer of a new drug, say even a cancer-reducing drug, all of society needs, but if you're the sole producer of that because you discovered it, you have a patent, you can charge a price for that up here, okay? When really the marginal cost of production may be down here. Why do we allow that? Why do we have patents that allow people to have, producers to have, pharmaceutical companies to have monopoly power, to price at monopoly rates? Well, we want to incentivize something, right? Well, you want to incentivize research and development. And so it's the necessary cost. If you didn't have that, such a system like that, if you didn't have patents, we'd have less innovation. That's pretty obvious, I think. So positive externalities can also be encouraged by the patent system. We want more of, that is, say, positive externalities. We want to move the market to the social optimum, and we want more of something than reward the developers with a patent. You wouldn't have any to start with, perhaps. Okay, so there's, broadly speaking, two different ways we can get these social outcomes that we want. We can either regulate, or we can produce market-based policies, either with taxes or subsidies. So there's regulation and there's market-based approaches. So your book has a discussion of this in section 2. They kind of give you an example here of how these two approaches might work, kind of with this hypothetical thing on page 196 of your text. Suppose, let's go to the dot cam here. Yeah, thank you. So you have two factories. I'm going to write as I speak here, if that's okay. So two factories, each dump, okay, so they're polluters. They each dump 500 tons of glop in the river. Now that's bad stuff. That glop is bad stuff. And so, the EPA comes along, scientists come along and say, really, you should only be dumping 300 tons. So here's the river, here's the two factories, okay, and each one of them is dumping. This is factory A and factory B. In fact, maybe this is a paper mill, they make paper, and this is a steel mill, they make steel, and they're just dumping like crazy in here. 500 tons in the river. But the EPA comes along and says, if we factored in the preferences of everybody who lives around these factories, now some of them work in the factories and so forth, but if we take all the stakeholders into account, then perhaps the optimal would be 300 tons, okay? Would be 300 tons from each. Okay, so when it says 500 tons, this is for each factory. So 300 tons for each factory. So that would be, well, we would move from 500 tons to 600 tons. So the government can come in and through regulation, okay, they can tell factories A and B, the paper mill and the steel mill, okay, so 500 to 300, now 300 is what you're allowed, so there's 600 tons total in the river, and so each of you need to chop 200 tons out of your output, and so you got to do it. This is called regulation, okay, this is how it's done. Okay, so obviously, they can tell them to do that, or they can tax. They can set a tax on each ton of steel and paper, or each ton of glop, rather, that's dumped into the river. One way, this is just by command and control. They can tell each firm, say, drop your glop from 500 to 300, so you have 600 tons of glop a year in the river. So this is kind of a brute force way of doing it. But another way of achieving this is by a tax, okay? It can impose a tax instead of simply telling these two firms, A and B, the paper mill and the steel mill. And so one suggestion might be a $50,000 tax per ton. And first off, what we see is if the tax were $5 million or high enough, it would shut both of these firms down. Both factories would shut down if the tax is high enough. They'll not pollute at all. Now that might not be good, right? Obviously, we think, oh, no pollution, that'd be wonderful. But what's the downside of a $5 bazillion tax that shuts them both down? What do you think?
No paper, no steel.
No paper, no steel. no jobs, okay, no tax revenue for the schools, etc. I mean, you know, the economy shuts down. So if the tax is too high, both shut down. But if the tax is too low, okay, let's think about that just a second. If the tax is, they could dump a ton of glop in the river for 50 cents, they're going to laugh at that, right? So if the tax is too low, they're not going to clean up at all. So I think we see that if there's a tax that's properly set, maybe it's $50,000 a ton, then you can achieve the same thing. Both firms in total will dump 600 tons in the river. Now notice I left some stuff blank here, top of that. Okay, because they've been dumping 500 tons each year. But there is a certain tax here that's going to achieve a total pollution level of 600 tons instead of 1,000. And here's the nice thing about simply imposing a tax, instead of the government wading in like a bully and saying, okay, you people, each one of you got to cut to 300, okay, is that if the tax is properly set, then the company, the one factory, perhaps it's a steel mill, that finds it very expensive to install technology to reduce their pollution output, they may say, hey, we'll go ahead and pay the tax. Okay, they may only go from 500 tons to 400 tons. In fact, this is the paper mill, so let me tell the story differently. I'll tell you what, it's probably more likely that the steel mill finds it difficult, very expensive, because the technology you lock into to make steel, for them to clean up. Okay, this is a steel mill. And with the steel mill, it's expensive to be clean. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so at a $50,000 ton, they say, well, we could save $100,000 if we could drop all the way to 300 tons of glop, but gosh, it's going to cost us a lot. Okay, so they may reduce their pollution level by only a little bit. But factory A, well, you know, it's less expensive for the paper mill than it is for the steel mill. So the paper mill will clean up more than the steel mill, will remove more pollution in its effluent to the river than will the steel mill. Okay, because the production technologies are different. I think we see, okay, that we can achieve the same outcome for society, but at a lower cost to the marketplace if we set the tax appropriately here. If we knew, for instance, that $50,000 per ton would achieve the same amount of total cleanup in that river, then for those firms that it's expensive to clean up, they're not going to, they'll go ahead and pay the tax, okay, which is really what this is. This is a fee, the tax is a fee for polluting. And the steel mill will pay the fee to pollute, whereas the paper mill may not. Okay, so, you know, the paper mill may reduce its pollution at a cheaper rate than the steel mill. And so the question then is, what level of a tax would achieve this sort of thing? Now they've got a picture on page 200 of your text where they talk about this Pigovian tax that could be applied to each unit of steel and, well, I'm sorry, each unit of glop, rather, that's dumped into the river to achieve the outcome we want. So we're going to look at the quantity of pollution or the quantity of glop that gets dumped in the river, and you realize that there's a demand for those pollution rights. If you think about this tax we're going to impose as being a fee for having the right to pollute, okay? Now, so you got a little different kind of market than we've looked at before. We've looked at product markets, say, where you have the quantity of a product here on the horizontal axis and the price of that. Now it's a little different, okay? It's almost as if for each ton of glop you're going to dump in the river, you got to have a little permit, okay, to do that. And what would you pay for that permit? Well, the steel mill is going to pay a lot more for the permits than the paper mill would. The reservation price, or the willingness to pay for each ton of glop that gets dumped in the river, is represented by this demand curve here. It's the demand for those pollution rights, okay? So if the tax is set at the right level, then you get the socially optimal output here of pollution. That's the good in this market, pollution rights, okay? So we want 600, say maybe we want 600 tons of pollution in our river each year, okay? This represents the preferences for the demand side. Who are the demanders? The polluters. They want to buy permits to pollute. Okay, so the highest, the demander that's going to pay the highest price for those pollution permits perhaps is the steel mill. And then we move down the demand curve, you're getting it down to prices where the paper mill will say, okay, I'll reduce mine. I'm not going to pay a whole bunch to cut back on my pollution, but a little bit, okay? So this is the good that's being exchanged in this particular market. So with a corrective tax here, you can achieve this outcome. And you can leave it up to the supply side of the market how to distribute the burden of cleaning up or implementing that policy. And you'll see that from a production point of view, it costs the two industries in total less to achieve this than it does for them just to adhere to this blanket command. Everybody is going to slash by 40%, whatever it is, 40%, from 500 to 300 tons. Okay, so this corrective tax will achieve this outcome, and this is called a Pigovian tax. Okay, essentially this is what we're doing when we if we looked at the good itself. This is quantity of pollution, okay? But again, if we go back to this familiar supply and demand curve where you're looking at the good, steel and paper, you have a supply and demand curve, you apply a tax to those things, you're ultimately going to achieve a total output from both industries equal to this, and where they're paying a price to pollute equal to this, a uniform price. Another way of achieving the same thing though, okay, again here, if you set the price appropriately, the price to pollute appropriately, if the government knows this demand curve, it can do that. A lot of times it doesn't know this demand curve. Doesn't know the technology that's being employed by the steel mill and the paper mill. The government may not really know how much it's going to cost those two plants to reduce their pollution. They may not know that technology. So they may not know exactly where to set this price to incline the two in total to produce 600 tons of glop to dump in the river. So they may move to this situation here. They say, well, we know what the outcome is that we want to achieve. So they may set a certain finite number of pollution permits, okay? 600 tons permits, so like trading cards. You got 600 of these cards here. You want to buy one? You got to go to the government, buy one. Actually, the government could auction off those 600 trading cards. Each one says 1 ton, good for, okay, here it is, good for 1 ton of glop in the river. I'm being a little silly here. Okay, what would you pay for this? Okay, the government could auction those off. They'd say, oh, you're going to pollute the river? You better show us your cards. And so if they auction them off, you'd see what the reservation price is for each firm. So if you don't know going into this the production technologies, so as to set this tax at an appropriate level to achieve the outcome you want, then instead what you could do is say, hey, we got 600 pollution permits. Each one's good for a ton of glop. Let's auction these off. And so you're going to see these firms willing to pay up here. Okay. Now, so in this case, the pollution permits and quantity are set by the government, and we can discover what this demand curve is. If the demand curve is uncertain, this corrective tax can be determined by an auction. Okay. So you can auction off the 600 permits. That's another way of achieving the same amount of pollution here. Of course, the government can really clean up here in this case. Okay? As the firms clean up physically, the government cleans up financially because it's bringing in revenue for each one of these permits. Yeah, Riley.
Would it be then viable to handle a pollution situation to initially require permits and use that auctioning process to determine the demand,
Determine this.
and then just apply a tax
Exactly.
from thenceforth?
Actually, that's done quite a bit. That's exactly right. To determine, that's how the government could determine where to set this uniform tax rate, is by first doing the auction. It's very good. Okay, so I want you to see those two broad approaches there. Okay, for achieving these socially, and when we talk about externalities, we're generally talking about negative externalities, but certainly education is probably the premier one where you have positive externalities and so forth. We're going to spend more time with this actually when we get to public goods as well, but that's in a later thing. Okay, we might look at some of these problems here just to kind of get a notion on this. So which of the following is an example of a positive externality? Okay, so Myra mows Dev's lawns, paid $100. That's number A. Myra's lawn owner emits smoke that Dev's neighbor Javier has to breathe. C. Dev's newly cut lawn makes his neighborhood more attractive. And D. Dev's neighbor Javier offers to pay him if he keeps his lawn well groomed. So we're talking about which is a positive externality. Well, it looks like C to me. Dev, his newly cut lawn makes his neighborhood more attractive. Now, there's other positive things here, okay? But notice there's a market, okay, for the good thing that happened. So if there's a market, if somebody gets paid for doing something in exchange, that thing in exchange is enhancing the quality of life in the neighborhood, that's not an externality, it's internalized. We say it's internalized when you pay. Actually, these processes I'm talking about here, where we move from externalities, we can internalize externalities by adding a dollar figure on one side. So again, this Pigovian tax that I talked about, that moves us from the market outcome to the socially efficient outcome. When you impose that tax on glop, okay, or when you provide a subsidy for your education, okay, that is being said to internalize the externality, okay, because then the people who participate in the market are following financial incentives. If you provide those incentives for people to do what's best for them financially, you have said, you have internalized the externality, okay? We'll look at some more examples of that. So perhaps this is a way of internalizing the externality, okay? You may have a neighbor who never mows their yard. You think, man, they're dragging my property. You're trying to sell your house. Well, you're suffering a negative externality. Internalize that by saying, hey, I'll pay you $100 to mow your yard. Okay, if the production of a good yields a negative externality, the social cost curve lies what? Above or below the supply curve or the private supply curve, and the socially optimum quantity is what? Higher or lower than the equilibrium quantity. Okay, so if there's a negative externality, there's some costs that are not being represented in the marketplace, right? So the social cost curve lies above the supply curve, and the social optimum quantity is greater than the equilibrium quantity. Okay, so you would have above and greater. Okay, I guess I need to say above and less. Let me the socially optimum quantity is less than the equilibrium quantity. Y'all can't even see that, can you? Sorry. Y'all have to throw something at me when you can't see. So you got too much of the stuff, right? So if there's a negative externality. Look at all these things I want to make sure I say in class, and I don't remember to say. But at any rate, look at number 3, okay? When the government levies a tax equal to the external costs associated with the goods production, it what? Increases or decreases the price paid by consumers and makes the market outcome more or less efficient. So this is that Pigovian tax we were talking about, right? So the government levies a tax equal to the external cost. It's going to increase the price paid by consumers. It costs more. You want that incentive there. We're going to internalize a negative externality here. So we're going to tax the demand side here. It increases the price paid by consumers and makes the outcome more efficient. Okay? That's the goal. All right, so why don't we skip down to 5 here? The government here auctions off 500 units of pollution rights for $50 per unit, raising $25,000 of revenue for the government. This policy is equivalent to a corrective tax of what? Hang on. Okay. So they're going to raise $25,000 of revenue. 500 units of pollution rights for $50. So if you multiply those together, you get $25,000 of revenue. Okay, so this is equivalent to a corrective tax of how many dollars per unit? Isn't it obvious? Okay, so it's $50. Okay, in other words, we're kind of inclining the one side of the market to change their behavior, and so we're imposing a tax of $50 per unit. Okay, so you can take this and divide by 500 and get 50, and that's how you can get this number right here. Okay, so one other thing I want to talk about here, and we got just a couple minutes. Watching the clock here, we won't get to this much today, but I do want to talk about private solutions to externalities next time. Just kind of introduce this a little bit today. We've talked here about the government coming in and moving the market to a socially optimal outcome. So either by a Pigovian tax or by subsidy. Okay? And now we're going to talk about private solutions to externalities. So think back again to the barking dog scenario here. So your book tells us a little story, and I wanted to use this story here about Horace and Emily on page 204 of your text. Pardon me here. So, excuse me, got Horace and Emily. Emily loves dogs. Okay, so Emily has a dog that barks at night. Okay. So she receives a $1,000 benefit, though, from her dog. Maybe this is each month. From her dog. Horace lives down the street. He can't sleep at night. Okay? So since he can't sleep at night, it's cost, because of the dog barking, it's costing him $1,500 cost from listening to the barking. Does that make sense? So the government could come in and say, oh, okay, we're going to pass an ordinance, no barking dogs. Emily would lose, okay? Or the city government can say, we don't care if you have a barking dog or not. Horace kind of loses in that picture, okay? Now, here's what we're going to do when we get to Coase's theorem. We're going to look at a private solution to that problem. That is, we're going to establish a property right. Here's where Emily lives with her dog. And here's where Horace lives, and he's got a frowny face. And we're going to set a property right on the air between the two houses. If someone owns that air, okay, the government's not involved, we can get that socially optimal outcome. Because someone either has to buy a permit to the other, pay a permit to get